Cross-functional risk is becoming operational in 2026. For years, executive teams tracked energy volatility, regulatory exposure, infrastructure constraints, and sustainability obligations as parallel risk streams. They were monitored in different dashboards, owned by different departments, and discussed in different meetings. Energy risk sat with procurement or facilities. Regulatory exposure lived inside legal and compliance. Sustainability targets were managed by ESG teams. Capital allocation decisions were made within finance. In 2026, that separation is breaking down. What were once independent variables are now interacting inside operating budgets, financing structures, and board-level strategy. A transmission delay affects emissions targets. Emissions targets influence debt covenants. Debt covenants shape capital flexibility. Capital flexibility constrains procurement and infrastructure sequencing. Executives are no longer managing isolated categories of risk. They are managing convergence. Energy availability is becoming a strategic constraint. Electricity demand in the United States is rising after nearly 2 decades of relative stability. The U.S. Energy Information Administration, EIA, projects total U.S. electricity consumption to continue increasing through at least 2027, driven by data center expansion, industrial electrification, and regional load growth in fast-expanding markets. At the same time, grid expansion is not keeping pace. Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory's most recent interconnection queue analysis shows well over 2,000 gigawatts of proposed generation and storage capacity awaiting grid connection, more than the total installed capacity of the existing U.S. power fleet. Projects are waiting not only on permitting approvals, but on transmission upgrades and system integration. For corporate leaders, this creates a practical tension. Capital may be available, sites may be secured, permits may be in process. Yet project timelines depend on infrastructure outside the company's direct control. Energy availability is no longer a background assumption embedded in financial models. It is becoming a gating variable in expansion strategy, M&A diligence, and electrification planning. The risk is not that power will disappear. The risk is that timelines will slip in ways that cascade across capital commitments and public targets. Insurance repricing and environmental exposure are entering the balance sheet. Climate-related losses are no longer episodic. According to reinsurance market data, global insured losses from natural catastrophes have exceeded $100 billion annually in multiple recent years. Insurers are responding with premium increases, revised deductibles, and stricter underwriting standards, particularly in regions exposed to wildfire, flood, heat stress, and severe storms. This repricing is not confined to coastal assets or traditionally high-risk geographies. Companies with distributed facilities are seeing underwriting questions intensify across multiple regions simultaneously. Insurance renewals now intersect with asset valuation. Higher deductibles alter cost assumptions. Coverage exclusions change risk transfer strategies. In some markets, capacity constraints are forcing companies to restructure coverage entirely. Simultaneously, regulatory expectations continue to evolve. State-level environmental reporting requirements are expanding, while federal enforcement posture remains uneven. Disclosure obligations tied to climate and environmental exposure are influencing investor scrutiny and public reporting. These pressures are interacting in financial statements. Environmental exposure is influencing reserve assumptions, impairment modeling, and discussions with credit providers. What was once considered a sustainability reporting issue is increasingly embedded in financial risk analysis. Compliance is no longer a separate reporting exercise. It is a component of capital structure planning. The cost of capital is no longer a neutral backdrop. Many corporate decarbonization and infrastructure modernization commitments were made during a period of historically low borrowing costs. That environment has shifted. Higher interest rates and wider financing spreads have altered hurdle rates for long-duration infrastructure projects. Renewable generation, storage deployment, transmission participation, and large-scale retrofits are now evaluated under a different capital cost framework. Sustainable debt markets are also recalibrating. Sustainability-linked bonds and loans, which expanded rapidly earlier in the decade, have faced increased scrutiny from investors demanding credible performance triggers and measurable outcomes. Slippage in emissions trajectories tied to infrastructure delays or energy constraints can now influence financing credibility. In other words, energy constraints and infrastructure lag do not merely affect operations, they affect financing terms. Capital remains available, but it is more conditional. Investors and lenders are increasingly focused on execution realism rather than forward-looking ambition. That shift narrows the margin for strategic misalignment. Infrastructure timelines are misaligned with corporate planning cycles. Transmission expansion operates on multi-year timelines. Municipal water systems face hundreds of billions of dollars in identified funding gaps under federal infrastructure assessments. Rail upgrades, port modernization, and industrial retrofits encounter permitting complexity and supply chain bottlenecks. Corporate planning cycles, by contrast, operate quarterly. Boards approve forward-looking strategy based on policy signals, market opportunity, and investor expectations. Operating teams, however, encounter physical bottlenecks that cannot be accelerated through internal coordination alone. This widening gap between strategic intent and infrastructure readiness introduces a new form of execution risk. Companies face difficult sequencing decisions. Should electrification plans be accelerated despite interconnection uncertainty? Should geographic expansion shift to regions with stronger grid capacity? Should capital be reallocated toward on-site generation to mitigate transmission delays? None of these decisions exist in isolation. Each interacts with financing, procurement, insurance, and compliance considerations. The internal coordination gap. The most underappreciated vulnerability may not be external. Energy teams are modeling load growth and procurement exposure. Sustainability teams are tracking emissions targets and disclosure obligations. Procurement teams are managing supplier volatility. Finance teams are adjusting capital allocation assumptions and cost of capital thresholds. If these models are not integrated, companies risk underestimating interaction effects. A delayed interconnection can slow emissions reductions promised to investors. Slower emissions reductions can influence sustainability-linked debt triggers. Revised financing structures can alter procurement timelines. Insurance repricing can change site selection assumptions. Each department may be acting rationally. The organization may still be misaligned collectively. The risk is not ignorance of individual issues. It is fragmentation. Simultaneity is the defining feature of 2026. In prior cycles, companies could absorb policy shifts or infrastructure delays independently. In 2026, the defining feature is simultaneity. Electricity demand is rising while interconnection queues remain congested. Insurance markets are repricing exposure while regulatory frameworks evolve. Capital costs are elevated while infrastructure timelines remain extended. Executives are not simply managing volatility, they are managing interaction risk, where individually manageable pressures combine into a material strategic constraint. The strategic question now facing leadership. The central question is no longer whether exposure exists. It is whether leadership teams understand where assumptions intersect. Where does energy availability influence emissions commitments? Where do emissions commitments influence financing structures? Where do financing structures constrain procurement or infrastructure sequencing? Companies that continue to treat energy, compliance, infrastructure, and capital as adjacent but separate domains risk underestimating the speed at which those domains now influence one another. The risks themselves are not new. The interdependence is, and that interdependence is what makes this moment operational rather than theoretical. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.